Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Ellen for the kind introduction, and to Heinrich, Böll, and Sebastian for sponsoring this event. As Sebastian mentioned, there's a lot of focus on the nuclear program, and in fact, it's come to define the United States' relationship with the Islamic Republic. It's front and center of the foreign policy debate, as you saw from last night in the presidential campaign. It is the primary subject between Iran, the negotiations going on between Iran and the P5+1, and it's the lens through which many Americans view the degree of the so-called Iranian threat. Lost in this fierce debate, as Sebastian mentioned, is Iranian public opinion. We don't have direct access to it in any meaningful way, and as a result, the views and the desires of Iranians are often discussed in the United States from an ideological point of view rather than from any sort of social scientist or empirical perspective. Some argue, for example, that with enough pressure from tough sanctions, at least a part of Iran's population will rise up against the government in response to the economic crisis, much in the way that we saw 2 weeks ago when there were demonstrations over the total collapse of the Iranian currency against the dollar. There were demonstrations across the country. Others argue that any significant opposition to the regime was crushed in 2009, never to reappear again unless perhaps there is some potential or some possibility for a change in government or regime change. In Iran, public opinion surveys, in fact, until recently, have not been part of Iranian political culture. And Iranians often ask themselves if their opinions even count. Do they count with their own government, and do they count with the outside world? This all makes today's discussion extremely relevant. We have a rare opportunity today to have brought a social scientist from Iran to give us great details on the views among Iranians on these issues, among many others. What is the level of support for Iran's nuclear program among Iranians? What are Iranian attitudes toward nuclear weapons? How do sanctions and the threats of military confrontation affect Iranian attitudes toward their country's nuclear program? And is there a correlation between the probability of war and Iranian views on the nuclear program? We are pleased to have Ibrahim Mohseni, who is to my far left, a lecturer at the University of Tehran and a PhD candidate at the Maryland School of Public Policy. And he will present his recent data on these questions and many others. As part of his dissertation, Ibrahim is investigating the factors that influence Iran's decision-making in regards to its nuclear program, and in particular, how sanctions affect the Iranian government's nuclear policies. To my right is Stephen Cole. I'm sure many of you know him. He's a familiar face in Washington. He will explain, among many other issues, how can we rely on the validity of polls conducted in an authoritarian state. And this is often the question that many people ask when trying to analyze polling results from Iran, given the restrictions, given the repressive environment. Stephen is a political psychologist who is director of the Program on International Policy Attitudes, which manages worldpublicopinion.org, and a senior research scholar at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland. He is also director of the Program for Public Consultation, which develops methods for governments to consult their publics on policy decision. Colin Cole, to my immediate left, will discuss this question among others. Even if we know and understand Iranian public opinion, is it a factor in U.S. policymaking? So again, this goes back to the question that a lot of Iranians have, that the outside world doesn't really give much regard to public opinion in Iran. Colin is an associate professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, where he teaches courses on international relations, international security, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. From early 2009 through 2011, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at the Pentagon. During his tenure there, he played a leading role in designing and overseeing the transition strategy in Iraq, and also the Pentagon's efforts to counter Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. The detailed biographies of all the speakers are available as handouts. So I think we'll begin the discussion with Stephen.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me. And good morning, and thank you all for coming. As Geneva was saying, the whole subject of polling in Iran often elicits a lot of questions. I don't know that we can answer them all, but there's always some question about whether in a society that has an authoritarian government, that is it possible to get reliable data out of people. The first question that often comes up is the data even real? Has it been fabricated? Could you send something to the polling agency and the government produces what they think it ought to say and sends it back to you, and that's all there is to it. We've addressed that question. A number of the polls that you'll hear discussed today have been conducted by calling into Iran from the outside. There are enough phone lines in Iran to make that viable, and what we have found is that there's not really a significant difference between the way that people respond in calls from the outside and the data that we get from the internally conducted polls that are there. Done there. We also have other tests for looking at whether it's likely the data was fabricated. It's sort of complicated to explain, but we've applied those as well to the internally derived data, and there does not appear to be a problem. So I don't really think that's much of an issue. Probably a bigger concern is that people are not responding honestly, that for fear of some kind of retribution, that they are censoring themselves. And that they don't want to be seen as disagreeing with the government in some way. Now, the data themselves essentially contradict that all Iranians feel that they can't disagree with the government. There are poll questions where options are presented. For example, there were in a poll around the time of the election, they were asked whether the Guardian Council should endorse candidates. Very sensitive question. And in fact, the Guardian Council does endorse candidates, and everybody knows that. And yet 75% said that they shouldn't. So obviously this is just one example. Another is that Iran has not established diplomatic relations with the United States, and 2/3 say that that they should, even though that's a sensitive subject. And they don't express unequivocal support for the government or the system, for the Guardian Council even. And interestingly, right around the time of the election, they were asked how they felt about their system of government, and only 49% said that they were very satisfied. And then during the crackdown, you might think that that number would go up, right, when there were real violent crackdowns occurring. But in fact, the numbers who are very satisfied went down 8 points to 41%. And the Guardian Council is not above any kind of reproach or kind of at least qualified support. Only 42% said that they had a lot of confidence in the Guardian Council, and those agencies that might be listening in, the Ministry of Interior, the police. Only 38% said that they had a lot of confidence in the Interior Ministry, and 52% the police. Also, after the crackdown, you might expect that the number of people saying that they voted for Ahmadinejad would go up, but that didn't actually happen either. It stayed constant around in the high 50s. But still, there might be more disagreement than the polls show. That doesn't, just because there isn't any, doesn't mean that there couldn't be some skew, and we always have to take that into account. There is evidence of self-censorship at times. After the crackdown, the number of people who said that they had voted for Mousavi went down, and few, when given the option of very confident, somewhat confident, not confident, not very many people say make a direct statement that they're not confident. So, but even if they don't say they're very confident. So when people say somewhat confident, we take that as being something less than full support and some, at least an implied criticism. So you have to kind of read the numbers in a slightly different way in this context. So it is. Yeah, so we always have to assume that it is possible that there's more criticism than the polls reveal. But from all these different polls and from doing focus groups, which I've done in Tehran, and other sources, when you put all these things together, there is a kind of coherent sense of what Iranian public opinion is like. And the polls do seem generally consistent. But I want to make a point here that the most important question isn't really whether there is more criticism than is revealed in the polls. I think the more important question is whether the model of Iranian public opinion that is guiding policy is correct, and whether the policies that are being pursued are having the desired effect on the public. And this is something that Ibrahim will be talking about as well, but I want to make a few points about it initially. Now, I want to identify what seems to me to be a kind of a model of Iranian public opinion that is kind of implicitly or even explicitly expressed in much of the American discourse. There are 5 points I want to make about that. The first is that the majority of Iranians resent their government. They basically want regime change. The demonstrations that occurred after the 2009 elections, which did include calls for regime change, and the Green Movement in general represent majority opinion. These are the people themselves rising up in contradiction to their government. And the second is that the majority of opinions have policy views that are more favorable to the United States than the views of the Iranian government. If the Iranian people were in control, things would be much better. The majority of Iranians don't really care about enriching uranium, and that they would be willing to sacrifice this in the face of U.S. military threats or international sanctions, the costs that they, of course, will be feeling strongly. And that increasing threats and sanctions increases the likelihood that the Iranian people will get upset about this. They'll have this aversive reaction, and then they're going to turn that anger toward the government. And then this will create a pressure on the regime to become more accommodating to Western demands. And then fifth, that the frustration of the government, of the public, due to the increasing sanctions and the fear of a possible military strike, might even lead the public to overthrow the regime and assert themselves. And as you can probably tell from the tone of my voice, I think there are a lot of problems with these assumptions, and I want to take a few minutes to outline what I think is probably a more correct perspective. And a lot of these points are based on polling data that we and others have done, and some of which Ibrahim will discuss. He's got a lot of he has some very fresh data, so he can really tell you what the newest is. But some of my points, though, are extrapolating from data from other Muslim countries as well. I've conducted with PIPA this major study of of a Muslim public opinion, and if you're interested, the book I wrote on the subject called "Feeling Betrayed: The Roots of Muslim Anger at America" is out on the desk if you're interested, at discount prices in effect for this morning. And of course, it's also been influenced by focus groups that I did in Tehran. So first, I'm going to make 5 points on this, that there are negative feelings toward the regime, but they're not of a revolutionary nature. Now, as in many countries, there are a lot of negative feelings in a lot of countries toward their government. Does that mean that they perceive that the government is illegitimate or that they want the government to be overthrown? No, not necessarily. There's certainly a lot of negative feelings for the government in this country. It doesn't mean they want the government overthrown. And even the people who say they voted for Musavi, who later, as I mentioned earlier, that the number of people who said they voted for Musavi went down. That the number of people who said that they voted for him is even less than the official numbers. And even they say the government is legitimate. And it's within the Iranian framework. What was going on over there relative to the Green Movement was really a competition between elites within the system. It wasn't something really outside the system. Musavi is seen as part of the system. He's a kind of alternative leadership within it. I think that to some extent when we look at what's going on there, you might think of how it looked to a Kremlin analyst in 1968 when Americans were demonstrating against Vietnam and other aspects of the American government, and some demonstrators did call for the overthrow of the system, and some were explicitly pro-communist, and leaders at that time portrayed these demonstrators as objecting to and a threat to the American way of life, and some, were explicitly anti-capitalist and so on. And in the Kremlin, you could have come to this conclusion that this force is really a force to overthrow the system. I think if you had made that judgment and had based any policies based on that judgment, you would have been in error. Now, what about the Arab Spring? Could something like the Arab Spring happen in Iran? Well, I'm not going to make a prediction here, but I'm just to say that the kinds of things that happened in Egypt and Tunisia were really quite different. The government was perceived in Egypt and Tunisia as being, in a sense, illegitimate, largely because it was they perceived as dominated by the United States. And the government was also perceived as considerably more secular than the public, and that is a correct perception, as we know. So the dynamic is really quite different. In Libya, you had a very fractious society. It's not a highly coherent identity. Iranians are quite different. They have a very strong and unified identity. So it's the dynamics that we saw in those countries are not likely to be transferred into the Iranian situation. Now, even as they do see their government as legitimate, Iranians are drawn to the idea of democracy, and there are indications that they would like more freedom, and they would also like more engagement with the West and America and so on. But at the same time, they're very committed to staying rooted in their Islamic identity, and this is very common in the Muslim world. I describe this as a kind of inner clash of civilizations. This attraction to liberalization, attraction to the West, attraction to globalization, and this desire to affirm their Islamic identity. And it creates contradictions in things that people say, that the will of the people should be the basis of government, the will of the people, the will of that Sharia should be the basis of government, and so on. And there is evidence that Iranians are, in a sense, chomping at the bit to some extent, but at the same time, they do see it as appropriate for the government to impose some constraints, and for Islam to play a role in government, and for laws to be vetted by Islamic scholars to determine whether they're consistent with Sharia and so on. So, this idea that they're underneath there, they aspire to the Western model. I just don't think that holds up, even though they are also drawn to it. Third, Iranians are also fascinated with America. But they're also genuinely angry with America. They perceive America as hostile to Islam itself, that is seeking to undermine Islam, and they perceive that Iran is a special target in this American intention to undermine Islam. That Iran is an Islamic state and holds itself out as a model for others in the Islamic world, and thus they believe that the U.S. has particular hostility to Iran. They're filling out this sense of how they feel about America. There is a kind of fascination, respect for certain principles that the United States has promoted in regard to international law, and the idea that international law should constrain all governments from using the threat of military force or using military force, and other principles related to human rights and so on. And then there's a perception that the U.S. doesn't live up to those principles, to those ideals, and that makes them really angry. This is something pervasive throughout the Muslim world, this sense that America lulls them with these fine ideals and then turns around and violates them themselves. And this makes them even more upset than if the U.S. hadn't put forward those principles to begin with. Okay, fourth, on the subject of uranium enrichment, this is not something that the average Iranian is blasé about. You could think, oh, who cares about enriching uranium? But no, this is it's very clear, and Ibrahim will show you the data. Very strong support for it, and even among the Mousavi supporters, they were for it. And if the idea that if you think that if Mousavi or the Green movement type people got in power, then this would solve the problem, there are no data to support that. In fact, Mousavi even criticized the Ahmadinejad for being too accommodating in some of the negotiations. So this is not a cleavage in the society. There are multiple reasons why they want this enrichment. It's not just about energy, it's also about pride and the prestige that comes from being able to enrich uranium, and they do want a breakout potential. They do want to be able to weaponize if needed. And they will implicitly say that even in polls. Military threats aren't likely to prompt Iranians to pressure their government. It's probably more likely to intensify their hostility toward the United States, and it will. It adds to the sense that America doesn't live up to its principles, cannot be trusted, and is hostile to Iran. And it's probably more likely to make them pull closer to their government than be more accommodating to the United States. It's also not clear that they think that it's actually going to happen. They at times have been a bit sanguine about the possibility that it's going to actually follow through. Okay, yeah, no problem. Let's see. Well, Ibrahim will be talking more about the sanctions, but and that they are likely to lead them to be also likely to make them to be more angry at the United States and draw closer to their government. Now, in our discussion when we come back later, I want to underscore right here that just because they're not effective with the public, or likely to lead the public to put pressure on the government, that doesn't mean that settles whether they should be done or not. There are a lot of reasons for why you should do sanctions when there's an international system and an international order, and the UN Security Council agrees on something, and Iran defies it. There's, it's like saying, well, you send somebody to prison, they just come out and they're more criminal, therefore we shouldn't have ever send anybody to prison. It's a complex subject, but it's not a given that if if the sanctions are not likely to increase pressure on the government from the people, then that settles it that it should not happen. Okay, two quick points I'm going to try to finish up with. The majority of the Iranian people right now are opposed to acquiring nuclear weapons. And, there are these fatwas, and those make a big impression on people. There is the sense that it's contrary to Islam. But there is a substantial minority that does want them, and Ibrahim's going to talk about that some more. Even though they know that's not the official position. That's really important. Overall, I would say the evidence is that the public is not a force against weaponization. It doesn't pull them against weaponization. The government has taken that position, and it's not that if you simply had the public in a greater role that this would mean that this would not happen. It might even increase the pressure for it, though it is not a majority position. The majority position is that they want to be part of the NPT, they want to be part of the international system, they want to be accepted internationally. It bothers them that they're accused of being in violation. They're very sensitive about that. They get very touchy, and they talk about things in a kind of legalistic way. Finally, I want to say that ultimately we should come around to the ultimate question, which is, what is possible? What can be done? And there is implicit in all these discussions a kind of deal that could be done. And just very quickly, it involves the United Nations and the U.S. accepting Iran having enriching to a 5% level, much more intrusive inspections, the West providing the 20% enriched fuel rods, and so on. Iran has come forward and basically suggested that this kind of thing, and the U.S. has been edging in this direction, and there's a lot of back and forth that I'm sure we'll get in, we'll talk about. I think there's sort of two ways that they negotiate on this. The U.S. sort of gradually makes little movements. It's like shows a little ankle, shows a little more ankle, shows a little more ankle, a little more flexibility. Well, the Iranians have this other tendency where they flash open and expose the leg and then cover it back up, and then we have a big argument about what just happened. But we didn't really say this. We didn't say. Then they asked to add all these qualifications, and then the whole and then things get bogged down, which is sort of where we are. And I should add that the Iranian people support this proposition. The American people support it, and it does have international support too. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in the background as we move along.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that overview. We'll turn to Ibrahim for the specific numbers.
Okay. Okay, the main questions that I'm going to be addressing today is basically three. One is, what is the level of support for Iran's nuclear program among the Iranian people? The second one is, what is the Iranian people's attitude toward nuclear weapons? And the third, which is I think of most policy relevance, is how do sanctions and threat of military confrontation affect Iranian people's attitudes toward their country's nuclear program? Now, to answer these questions, I'll be relying on some 22 surveys that have been conducted in Iran over the past 10 years. Polling is not unprecedented in Iran. And this is what I want to show, through this graph, is just the polls that have been conducted by Western agencies and research centers calling into Iran are sufficient to answer some of these questions. Even if we don't rely or trust on data that is collected within Iran, if we just rely on data that has been collected using calling centers located outside of Iran, we would arrive at the same conclusions and at the same numbers that I'm going to be presenting here. The numbers match up. And that's the beauty of science. It doesn't matter who does it. Even if Netanyahu was to do these polls, he'll get at the same numbers. Just to clarify, some of these surveys have been conducted face-to-face inside Iran, Some of them are conducted using the computer-assisted telephone interviewing technique, which is the standard in most countries nowadays. And these telephone calls, as you can see, some of them have been conducted using agencies located outside of Iran calling into Iran. Some of them are basically surveys that have been conducted by agencies within Iran that conduct surveys. Now, let's go to the numbers. First, on the civilian nuclear power and technology, all of these surveys show a very stable and strong support for civilian nuclear power and technology among the Iranian people. And despite the rising pressures on Iran, that hasn't been stable, right? It has been rising, particularly over the last years. There is no evidence that that support has eroded in any way. And these are the numbers. These are the percentage of people who think it is very important for Iran to have a civilian nuclear program. Almost all of them over the 80 percentage points. And overall, and these are the people who say it's somewhat important. Overall, during the past 6-7 years, the numbers have been over 90% of the public supporting a civilian nuclear program. These numbers are, in polling, these are very high numbers. You usually don't get 90% agreement on anything almost. And this is one of those rare situations. Now, going to the more sensitive issue of what is the Iranian people's attitude toward nuclear weapons, this is where, there's a divided opinion. There is an increasing minority. Now, the increasing part is debatable, but there is a minority who continues to favor Iran developing nuclear weapons, and it's a significant minority. But most Iranians think that Iran is not, the country, the Islamic Republic, is not pursuing nuclear weapons. Most Iranians agree with the fatwa that development of nuclear weapons is contrary to Islam. But one thing I want to caution, particularly the researchers who are conducting surveys in Iran, it makes a difference whether you say nuclear weapons or if you say atomic bombs. What we have discovered over repeated surveys that the second you use the term nuclear, that elicits support. The person doesn't listen to the rest of the question. The second you say hastei, that does it. They're in favor of it. And that's why a lot of the times the survey questions that use nuclear weapons, they tend to generate higher support level than if you use atomic bomb. That makes it clear that we are not talking about the civilian aspect, we are talking about the military aspect. And these questions, these surveys conducted, use the term nuclear weapons, the one that generates higher support. And we see, at least about a third of the public strongly support the country having a nuclear weapon program. And if you add the somewhats as well, sometimes you get a majority of people supporting a nuclear program. And again, I want to caution, there is a problem with this question because it uses the nuclear weapon term. Now, the polls that I've conducted very recently, and the 2012 polls are just about a week old, so they're very fresh. When we ask Iranians how important do you think it is for Iran to develop atomic bombs, we get about 38% saying it's very important and 5% saying it is somewhat important. On this side, the people who say it's not important don't even, it's a bare plurality, it's 50%. So it's not a majority of people thinking that it's that Iran should not have it. This is a more, I think this is a better question that have been asked before, and we have asked it again, which we ask, which of the courses of action you prefer for Iran? The first one is to have both atomic bomb and nuclear power. And in 2009, the numbers were 38%. Today, it's 41%, so there's a slight increase in the percentage of people who say we should have both atomic bomb and nuclear power. And on the other hand, the percentage of people who say we should only have nuclear power has remained very stable at about 56%. And the number of people, the percentage of people who say we should not have any programs is basically, below 5%. 3% back in 2009, 1% today. Now, you might ask, okay, who are these people? Are these, the hardcore government supporters, hardcore Ahmadinejad? In fact, it's somewhat opposite. The people, as I'm going to show, the more people are drawn toward the government, it is more likely that they'll say we should only have nuclear power. The more they get exposed to internet or satellite TV, the more likely it is for them to favor Iran having a nuclear weapons program. And I'm going to show why, in the later stages. But, one of the questions we ask is, how often do you use the internet? 52% of people who say we use the internet on a daily basis say that Iran should have both atomic bomb and nuclear power. And as you can see, as the number declines, and this is very much associated with education and age and those stuff as well, as I'm going to discuss. But as the numbers decline, so does the support to have an atomic weapon, a nuclear weapon program. The same thing with satellite TV. And these are the people who are watching BBC, VOA. They're exposed to Western news. It's the same exact story. The people who are exposed more, and again, I'm going to show why this is, the people who are exposed to satellite TV are more likely to say we should have an atomic and nuclear weapon program as compared to those who are not at all exposed to that sort of a program. Now, the other question we asked the Iranians, so the first question is that which one of these course of actions you prefer? The second question is, okay, we said, okay, what do you think the government is actually doing? Now, only 24%, so the red lines, I will call this red. The red bars are what they prefer, what people prefer. The yellow bars are what they think the government is actually doing. And only 24% think the government is pursuing a nuclear weapons program, while 68%, more than 2/3 of the public, think the government is only pursuing a nuclear power program. And obviously, no one thinks that the government is not pursuing any programs. This is very important, as I'm going to discuss. This creates a pool. This creates a kind of a pool by this section of the population who want to have a nuclear program, but they think the government is not doing it, particularly since majority of, 72% of the Iranian people think that if the government decided to go nuclear, it does have the technical ability to do so. So it's not a technical issue. It's not a capability issue. It's a decision that the government has not made issue. It's the fact that they're only pursuing a nuclear power program is not because they lack the capability to have a nuclear weapons program. It's because they don't have the will. They have not made that decision yet. And 72% think that. They think if we decide to produce nuclear weapons, we could do that today. But the good question, the good news is that while 98% of the public think that possession of nuclear technology is a national right, only 48% think that possession of nuclear weapons is a national right. And as Steve mentioned, majority of the public believe that producing nuclear weapons is contrary to the principles and the teachings of Islam, which is very important in that country. Now, when we go to the next question, we discuss, okay, if these are the situations with regards to nuclear civilian nuclear energy and the weaponization part, how do sanctions affect those perceptions and those opinions? Now, the results that we have shows that sanctions have been hurting, definitely, but they have not helped to persuade the Iranian people that Iran should forego nuclear enrichment. There is no evidence for the pain of sanctions negatively affecting support for Iran's nuclear program among Iranians. And in fact, what is very significant is that Iranians are not willing to forego enrichment even if it results in a war, and this is one of the questions that we have asked. So, just to start, the general questions that is asked all over the world, that over the past year, has Iran's economy, as well as another question, your own economic situation, has it become better, worse, or has it remained the same? These red lines are about Iran's economy. 57% say that over the past year, Iran's economy has suffered. It has become worse. Less so about the respondents' own economic situation. But as far as the country, the perception about country's economy, 57% say it has become worse. Now, a very big question now in today's Iran's domestic politics is who's to blame. That's always the issue when something goes wrong, right? If something goes wrong anywhere, the people are starting looking for a culprit. And it's very important politically, particularly as we near the presidential elections, because if the blame falls on Ahmadinejad, his chances of putting Medvedev into office is going to decline significantly. But the main culprit. So people are when you ask them what is most to blame, and you provide them with these three options, which is the general discourse in Iran: Ahmadinejad's incompetence, obstructionism of Ahmadinejad's domestic opponents, or is it sanctions? Now, we say what is most to blame. Obviously, people say if you give them a chance, they'll say it's a combination of all of these. But when we say what is the most significant, most important culprit, sanctions is the one. 65% say our economy has become worse over the past year as a result of the sanctions. Okay, now the next question we ask is, to what degree would you say the sanctions have had a negative impact on Iran's economy? Back in 2009, 23% used to said a lot. Today, 35% say it has a lot of negative impact. Back in 2009, 37% said it has some negative impact. Today is 31. And in general, we have a general rise in the number of people who say sanctions are having a negative impact on the economy. A Gallup poll, supports this data as well. This is a 2001 Gallup poll asking, do you think the sanctions will hurt the livelihood of Iranians a great deal, somewhat, or not at all? And as you can see, 27% say a great deal, 38% say somewhat, only 25% say not at all. And so Iranians are basically saying the sanctions are hurting, but there's more to this story. It doesn't stop there. They expect it to increase. So it is hurting, and they expect it to hurt even more into the future. We asked them, if Iran continues enriching uranium, how likely do you think it is that the current sanctions against Iran will increase? 42% have no doubt that it will increase. They say definitely it will increase. So the credibility of that threat is very active, and it's present. But then, when we offer them a way out of these pains and these pressures, when we offer them a deal which is much better than the deal which P5+1 is offering Iran, and when we word the question in a way to make the concession seem of a minor cost, majority, a large, say, a very strong majority oppose it. When we tell them, would you favor or oppose an agreement whereby all current sanctions against Iran would be removed and Iran would continue its nuclear energy program, except that it would agree not to enrich uranium? Even that form of a question does not garner favorable responses. 29% favor it, 59% would oppose such a deal. So to put all of these together, the Iranians are saying the sanctions are hurting, we expect them to increase, but we should not give up nuclear enrichment. And you might ask, okay, who are these people who oppose? Again, I just want to show one slide which correlates it with education. The more educated Iranians become, the less likely it is that they'll favor that deal. The more likely it is that they'll oppose it. And again, I will show some aspect of why that is. This was, this is a new question that we have asked, and I would love to run it again and again to have a trend data on it. We say, which is closer to your opinion? Iran should continue its nuclear enrichment activity even if it results in a war, versus Iran should prevent a war from occurring even if it means suspending nuclear enrichment activity. And the number of people who say we should continue enrichment, again, it's slightly lower now that we are talking about war, but not much, by 4 percentage points. 55% say we should continue enriching uranium, while 33% say preventing the war is of higher importance. Now, what is the effect of coercion? Particularly of that of military confrontation? There is a strong positive correlation between fear of military action against Iran and support for an Iranian nuclear weapon program. Respondents who think a country might attack Iran are significantly more likely to favor Iran developing nuclear weapons as compared to those who are not worried about an attack on Iran. And as West increases pressure on Iran for its nuclear program, America's favorability ratings in Iran just plunges. And just a couple of the numbers. So this is the question of how likely it is that another country might attack our country due to its nuclear program. Majority of people are here. But there is a large minority that are in the likely place. So luckily, somewhat. People who say another country is very likely to attack our country, majority of them say we should go and have a nuclear weapons. And it makes perfect sense. And they say it's very important. And it makes sense. It's pure political science. If you think someone is going to attack you, you want to defend yourself, and you think a way of defending yourself is arming yourself with nuclear weapons. As compared to those who say it is not likely that another country might attack our country, only 38% of these people think that it is very important for Iran to develop atomic bombs. The other question is the same thing. Remember the question of whether Iran should have both atomic bomb and nuclear power? The people who say it is very likely that another country might attack our country due to its nuclear program, 47% of them think that Iran should have both atomic bomb and nuclear power, as compared to only 25% of those who say it is not likely that another country would attack our country. So thinking about, that through coercion, through threat of military confrontation, through putting all options on the table, the Iranian people are going to say, now we should just capitulate. It's the exact contrary. The more we, the more we threaten them with military confrontation, the more likely it is for them to say that we should arm ourselves with a deterrent to prevent such a confrontation from happening. And again, this is all of the past data as well. It's the same correlations. This is not the data that I'm presenting is the newest data, the one which is about 1 week old. But the past data that have been collected by all other agencies and research centers, the same correlations exist there as well. And guess what happens to opinions about the U.S. Through this time, where pressure on Iran has been increasing for something Iranian people value. It's there. If there was a situation like in South Africa, where the government was being sanctioned for something that the South Africans were not approving of, you would not see this. You would see the exact opposite, because the people are saying, yeah, sanction our government. Our government is doing something we do not like. Okay, here is the exact opposite. The government is doing something that the Iranian people support, and it is being sanctioned by the international community for doing what the people are asking the government to do. So who is getting the blame? The people who are imposing the sanctions. These are the numbers of U.S. favorability, or in fact unfavorability rankings. In 2002, you had 63% having an unfavorable view of the U.S. And as the pressure has increased, so has unfavorability ratings of the United States. Now it's close to 90%. And this is very significant. The reason it is significant is that a lot of the correlations we have run on the determinants of Iranian public support for a nuclear weapon program, a big player is the United States. People who have a favorable view of the United States are more likely to favor a conciliatory posture. People who have an unfavorable view of the United States, tend to be more defiant. And as the number of people who have this sort of views of the United States increase, the likelihood that there is going to be the required trust for a negotiated solution to be achieved is also going to decline. So the main, I think one of now the polling data is over. Now I'm going to just provide some analysis here quickly. I think Netanyahu, when he went to the United States, to United Nations, and he showed the capability issue, that this should be our red line, the capability aspect. What he, I think, forgot, or what he did not say, is that capability is only one side of the issue, one side of the problem. Intent and the political will and determination is, in fact, the more important factor, which could drive people toward developing nuclear weapons. Now, this is classic political science, that if a nation's become determined to develop nuclear weapons, it eventually will. And in our course of action, in our course of policy toward Iran, we have focused so much on the capability side that we have lost sight on the determination and political will and public opinion side. And what has actually happened is that as we have increased pressure to limit that capability, we have in fact added to the number of Iranians who think that Iran should develop nuclear weapons. And as an academic once told me, is that in this situation you cannot threaten a nation into feeling safe. The more you threaten a nation, the more insecure they feel, the more likely it is that they'll look for means to make themselves feel safe. And in fact, Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa, this is very wrongly understood here, as I've heard many times from people who should know, is that the Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa against nuclear weapons was in fact directed toward a domestic audience. He knew better than anyone that, over here in the West, in Europe, the fatwa is not going to be regarded as being serious. His fatwa was directed toward the domestic audience to curb, potential public support toward a nuclear weapon. Because if that would become a public demand in Iran of the government, it's not going to be something that the government will be able to deliver. And that's, for people who study Iran, they know quite well that the government's biggest concern is being perceived as being incompetent, is being perceived as not being able to deliver to the Iranian people. And the fatwa was basically to limit the expectations, the public expectations, to say that this is not a national interest issue, this is a religious issue that we cannot even talk about anymore. This has roots in our religious beliefs. This should not turn into a national interest debate. But then there might be the issue of why are Iranians so resistant? First of all, people who study sanctions and their effect, they usually come to this country that there is more likely that nations will resist sanctions than to capitulate. Nations usually do not. It's quite rare for nations to capitulate under sanctions. We don't have much historical support for that. But for Iran in particular, there are some aspects that we should not forget. One aspect of it is ideology. Shia ideology glorifies resistance, particularly when it's done to safeguard a legitimate cause against the starkest of odds. Each year, just as an example, each year Iranians commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, who died some 1400 years ago, and they honor him for not surrendering under, despite this starkest odds. Today is the only tourists that go to Iraq are Iranians. Where are they going? They're going to Karbala. Where is Karbala? It's where Imam Hussein, the third Shia Imam, is buried. And the people who know what I'm talking about, there's a lot to cover here. But this is an element of Iranian culture which has a lot of policymakers here miss. That ideology makes it's quite important, and one element for this is. But despite that, is the bad historical experience with compromise. The green area, I don't expect you to be able to read all of these, but the colored area are basically territories that Iran lost during the past 100 years as a result of concessions. This is in the Iranian psyche, that concessions make us lose. And the greatest, the two treaties, the Golestan and Turkmenchai treaties, in which Iran lost this territory to Russia, are basically regarded as a disgrace. So this is one aspect of it. Good experience is the Iran-Iraq war. It's the only war in the in past 200 years in which Iran did not lose any of its territory. And it is perceived that it is because, we resisted. We resisted Saddam's aggressions despite all odds. And a lot of people in this town unfortunately forget that experience. That's history. It's not history for the Iranian people. For the public, many Iranians actually lost a lot of relatives in that war. But more importantly, for policymakers here is to realize that a lot of today's policymakers are the veterans of that war. Dr. Jalili, Iran's chief negotiator, he is, picture right here. He is a veteran of that war. Fereydun Abbasi, Iran's currently head of Iran's atomic agency, who was target of assassination, is a veteran of that war. They remember that war, that despite international support for Saddam, despite the fact that, as Saddam was using chemical weapons, no one was raising any voices, the fact that we resisted allowed us to preserve our territorial integrity. Only time in Iran's history where Iran did not lose a single inch of its territory. other bad experiences. By the way, these are in Iranian psyche. I'm just trying to explain that side of psyche. Where does this resistance come from? Is another bad experience is when Iran actually agreed to suspend. What did they get in return from Iranian perspective? Not much. The Turkey-Brazil deal, which was drafted based on President Obama's letter to Erdogan, it was dismissed by Secretary. These are bad experiences. And what these do is it makes Iranian policymakers, those who might want to favor a conciliatory posture, it's no longer a career-enhancing position to take, that we should, be more conciliatory. There would be points to these past experiences, and they would say, that's not going to help you. And there are also current experiences, and I'll be quick with these. There's the current experience that resistance has in fact paid off, and one of those areas is scientific advancement. Sanctions are increasing the need to become more self-reliant. Self-reliance in turn requires scientific and technological advancement, and technological and scientific advancement required has pushed the government to intensely invest in research and development in all fields. And I'm not going to make this a guess game, I was going to, but if you look at, these are the scientific papers that have been published by various countries. Guess which one is Iran? Which one of these lines is Iran? It's this one.
Whoa.
It's this one. This is, science metrics. This captures the number of scientific papers that are published. And see when it starts increasing in an exponential fashion. This is Israel. This is Belgium, Norway, Argentina, South Africa, Egypt, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and this is the course. This is what Iran has been able to achieve through resistance. And this shows Iran's rank among nations. This is against the number of scientific papers published in international journals. Back in these are name of countries, I just have highlighted Iran. 1996, Iran ranked the 53rd nation. And look what Iran, as the pressure has gone up, so has Iran's urge for more scientific development. And today it stands at, the 16th among nations. So, I'm just going to through these. The last thing is the soft power aspect. Why Iran is resisting? It's the soft power aspect. And I think Ayatollah Khamenei's speech in this regard captures this quite nicely. He said this in the Friday prayer. He said, these sanctions have benefited us because the Western powers have stressed that through these sanctions, they want to force Iran to back down on its nuclear program. Well, when we do not back down, and we will not back down, what happens? In the eyes of the people in the region who have just revolted, the West and their threats will no longer be perceived as being credible. And Iran's power will become more admired. And that is in our interest. And that's the purpose why Iran loves U.S. drawing the red lines, because as it crosses those red lines, and these are this is courtesy of Foreign Policy magazine in an article, I think it was last week. These are all of the red lines that the West has drawn for Iran since 1995. First, no Bushehr reactor, well, that's gone. And, all the way going to no enrichment above 5% back in 2010. Iran crossed that red line as well without any consequences. And, that, helps Iran advantage. So the rationale behind resistance is that why should we concede? The sanctions have been placed before Iran even had a nuclear enrichment program. So to say that we are sanctioning you as a result of the nuclear enrichment program is not very credible among the Iranian public. Iranians have no doubt that the Western demand and pressures would not end even if Iran suspends its nuclear activity. And it's due to its experience during these 3 years when Iran basically agreed to everything the West was demanding. And the other bigger problem is that demands from Iran are concrete. Stop enrichment program, stop doing this, stop doing that. They're objectively, it can be measured whether Iran is cooperating or not. While what Iran would get in return from their perspective is vague, and they often lack credibility. And finally, it's the issue that dependence on West is dangerous. In one of my focus groups, one individual put it quite well and said, if the West is capable of using medicine for cancer patients as a leverage to achieve political ends, and referring to the Tehran research reactor, which the West refused to provide nuclear fuel for, it would definitely use nuclear fuel as a leverage to achieve political ends vis-a-vis Iran. So with these, all of these explain why Iranians, they're saying, yes, the sanctions are hurting, yes, we expect them to increase, but no, conceding is not our way out of it. It's something else, and that's the deal that Steve pointed to, which garners majority support, and which is that we do what we have a right to do from an Iranian perspective, and on the other hand, U.S. and the International Atomic Energy Agency could have more intrusive, higher levels of inspection. That's something they think is a way out of the current situation. With that, I'll end.
Thank you very much. Most of what you said completely defies conventional wisdom, at least in Washington, particularly your statistic about people supporting enrichment, even if there's a definite threat of war. So with all of this Iranian public opinion that seems to sort of counter maybe what the U.S. government might have figured out and all of this, Colin, can you give us some insight into what the United States has done wrong and sort of what the discussions have been under sort of the Obama administration?
Well, I think actually the report card is more mixed. And let me say a few things about that. First of all, I should make clear that while I used to work for the administration, I don't anymore. And so everything I'm saying is my personal analytical judgment and in no way reflects official administration policy, which I'm not privy to anymore anyway. I think it's important to take a step back and just very briefly note what the administration is trying to achieve and what it's not trying to achieve, because that can help us understand where public attitudes might matter and where they might not. The stated objective of the Obama administration is to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. It is not to prevent Iran from having a civilian nuclear program. It is not regime change. The Obama administration is pursuing pressure, but it remains open to diplomacy. Now, we could have a debate about whether they have been open enough to diplomacy. I mean, you mentioned the, attempting to pull a rabbit out of the hat in the Turkey-Brazil Tehran declaration, but of course that was 5 months after Iran accepted the initial deal and then rejected that same deal. So we were in a very different place by then too. So we can have a back and forth about whether diplomacy has been tried enough or not, but if there's no debate about whether the administration remains open to diplomacy and in fact would prefer a diplomatic outcome to this than a military confrontation. At the same time, I think the president's made pretty clear that all options are on the table and that all instruments of U.S. national power will be used to achieve the objective, which is that Iran will not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. And if you take that at face value, it means if sanctions and pressure and diplomacy don't work, there's going to be a war. Because that's the only mechanism, the only instrument of national power left. So let's hope that some combination of diplomacy and other tools succeeds short of that. So the question is, do public attitudes matter for U.S. Iran policy? The answer is yes, in the sense that for sanctions and pressure to work, public attitudes are at the very least an intervening variable in that process. That is, they are a mechanism whereby sanctions, quote unquote, can work. The goal of sanctions, I know not everybody believes this, but the goal of sanctions is not in and of it's not just to cripple the Iranian economy for its own sake. Nor do I think is it to impose regime change, although there are some people in town who would like that to be the goal. I do think the goal of the sanctions is to hold the Iranian regime at risk. There's a difference between holding the Iranian regime at risk in order to try to compel a change in behavior than a regime change policy. all right, even though they have somewhat similar effects. And the role of public opinion matters here. There's a couple of different mechanisms whereby sanctions, pressure, and public opinion may come together to resolve this issue, okay? And I think a lot of the data that was just presented bears on how likely this stuff is to work. One mechanism would be that if pressure changes public attitudes in Iran as it relates to the desirability of the nuclear program in general or a nuclear weapons component of that program. If it does, then it may provide an incentive for the regime to change course, or at the very least provide the regime more political space to reach a compromise without losing support. The data basically shows that it's not having that effect. That there's no evidence that it's lessening the desire for a nuclear capability or the desire among that minority which supports nuclear weapons capability. The sanctions are not having that effect. The second mechanism, according to this data and the data it appears to be consistent with from previous studies, the second mechanism, and I think this is actually the more realistic mechanism, is that sanctions produce a concern within the regime about the possibility of a Persian Spring, of the possibility of domestic unrest. That is, that the sanctions put the regime at risk by generating the possibility of domestic turmoil. Not the inevitability, the possibility of domestic turmoil. So the regime cuts a deal in order to save itself from the prospect of widespread unrest. And this is what was the most interesting thing about the collapse of the rial over the last several months and the protests that broke out, the riots that broke out 10 days ago, is not the effect on inflation. I mean, that matters very much for everyday Iranians. But it's whether the regime starts to fear more things like this and believes that look, Mubarak was a regime that was in place for 30 years and collapsed in 18 days, right? So does the regime start to be concerned that it's more brittle and vulnerable to this type of unrest, and does it associate the economic hardship with the possibility of more unrest, and therefore is willing to cut a deal? The question then becomes, I guess, who does the populace in Iran blame for the sanctions, right? If they blame the government, then the possibility of sanctions producing anti-government unrest goes up. It doesn't appear decisively that they blame the government. It appears that they blame the sanctions for their problems more than, say, government mismanagement, although they could still blame the government for bringing the sanctions down on them. So polling that suggests that they blame the sanctions for economic hardship doesn't suggest that they don't blame the government. They could blame the government for bringing the sanctions down on their heads. The polling that you suggest that says that the majority has increased their anti-American sentiment as a result of the sanctions may suggest that they blame the United States, but it's not mutually exclusive with the notion that they blame the United States and they blame their government for bringing this hardship down on them. Those are not mutually exclusive. Nor does it require a majority of Iranians to feel that way. All it requires is a substantial enough minority to feel that way to be able to produce unrest, or the possibility or the fear of unrest. Because that is what I think folks are banking on in terms of the calculation of the regime. And frankly, I don't think your polling speaks directly to that question. It's not dispositive one way or another. So one question that your polls don't answer is, are there enough disgruntled Iranians and enough possibility of unrest to spook the regime into a compromise? All right, just not answered in the data. I think the polling, the public attitudes data also matters as it relates to how the utility of a military threat. Putting all options on the table, beating the war drums even more dramatically in the way that, say, the Israelis have done, or say Mitt Romney has done at times during the presidential campaign. I think that there is some clear evidence in your data to suggest that military coercion strengthens the desire for a nuclear deterrent among some subset of the population. And I think it's particularly striking the finding that they care so much about the right to domestic enrichment that they're willing to run the risk of a war. And I think that's a really, really important factor for U.S. policymakers to keep in mind. But I think actually public attitudes matter less when it comes to whether military coercion can get the regime to back down than is the case with sanctions. While sanctions, the mechanism is creating a fear in the regime's mind of domestic unrest. For military coercion, the target is not the people of Iran. The target is the regime directly. Because the military coercion does not have to work through public attitudes to have an effect on the regime. Military coercion military action can decapitate the regime. All right. One interesting, or at least the Iranian regime may fear that it can. Look, I don't think there's any evidence that the Iranians fear an Israeli strike. I think there's considerable evidence that they don't want a war with the United States. They saw that the United States struggled in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they also saw that the United States decapitated Saddam Hussein's regime in 3 weeks, a regime they couldn't defeat in 8 years. Right? They fear the United States military. Right? So there still is a mechanism whereby military coercion could arguably change the calculus of the regime. Now, I don't know whether it will or it won't, but your data doesn't speak to that particular logic. So there is still an argument that some combination of economic and military coercion could force a compromise. I'll say two other things. One is, does your data overwhelmingly suggest that what we're doing now is counterproductive? That is it making the situation worse? And there, I think actually it most definitively suggests it isn't. For this reason, if you look at public attitudes across your graphs for the last decade on support for the nuclear program and support for nuclear weapons on the aggregate level, they're the same. So the support for the nuclear program has remained constant even as pressure has gone up. So the pressure isn't reducing support for the nuclear program, but there's also no evidence that the pressure is increasing support for the nuclear program. So we can say that it's not having a net counterproductive effect on the desire of people to acquire across the board. Because look at the graphs, they're flat. And you can't explain a constant with a variable. And the variable in this equation is pressure going up, and yet support for the nuclear program has not gone up. Okay? So that's one important factor. Related to that is, it's not clear to me what the alternative is. If you take that baseline, which is that support for the nuclear program is very robust and has remained flat, irrespective of whether pressure has been up or down, then removing the sanctions and taking the military option off the table, there's no evidence that that would reduce the desire for a nuclear weapons capability. Right? So the opposite of what we're doing now doesn't necessarily resolve the problem, at least as it relates to the U.S. objectives either. So the question then is, what would resolve the problem? And this is where I think your data is particularly important, because and I actually don't think, it may be against the conventional wisdom on Capitol Hill and some segments of this town, but it's not against conventional wisdom as it relates to every Iran expert on planet Earth. And that is that this regime will not accept a diplomatic deal that doesn't respect their right to enrichment. That's it. I mean, I wish it weren't so. And we can have a debate about whether a temporary suspension of enrichment, perhaps couched in certain language, like pegging levels of enrichment to current domestic needs, which are 0. We could have a dance about that. But in terms of a permanent suspension of enrichment, or foregoing the right to enrichment, there's been too much of the regime's legitimacy banked up in standing up for Iran's inalienable rights to back down from that equation. And your evidence that the public largely endorses that logic, I think, is there. The fatwa is interesting because the fatwa basically gives the regime a way out. I don't know whether the supreme leader means it or not, frankly. And there's a theological conversation that can be had about whether it's disinformation or it's dissembling or it can be changed willy-nilly or whatever. What I'm more interested in actually is the point that you make, which is the fatwa is creating some political space for a compromise. It's saying, look, we don't want nuclear weapons. In fact, it's against Islamic law to have nuclear weapons. So in the event that they ever compromise and confirm to the international community that they don't want nuclear weapons, all he's doing is confirming the fatwa, right? He's not backing down. And the other face-saving dimension of this then is there some right to domestic enrichment, perhaps capped at 5%? And that, if there's a deal to be had, it's that. It's that the regime fears unrest, the regime fears a war. And to get out of that, they sign a face-saving deal that gives them a lot of nuclear activities, a lot of nuclear cooperation, but caps their enrichment at 5% under extraordinarily intrusive inspections. That's the only deal that I see as possible, and I think that your data confirms that is the only deal that's politically viable in Iran. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Now we'll go to Q&A, but I just wanted to, before we begin, have the two of you, yes?
Can I have 5 minutes to address?
Yes, well, I was going to ask you to address specifically the issue of fear, because the data don't really, the data that you've presented hasn't really addressed this issue. And also, I mean, I think that on the issue of fear, there a lot of things that generally go on in terms of the regime's interpretation of fear. They respond, generally the response to any potential unrest is disproportionate to the fear, to the risk at hand. So it's always overkill. I mean, they did that in '99, it was the same in 2009. So I guess my question to you is, how do you assess the fear within the population, and do any of your statistics address that you haven't presented? And I guess to Colin, how do you sort of view the regime's inability to deal with risk? Because from their point of view, they're very confident. I mean, they're not very intimidated by risk, generally as they perceive it, and we saw that again in '99 and 2009. So there would have to be a lot of risk,
Yep.
I guess, and a lot of
Correct.
of intimidation,
Correct.
to change behavior.
Correct. Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in a
Okay.
second. Go ahead.
Okay, just a couple of things. The idea that the pressures might create unrest against the government is something which is not. I wish I had it here. I presented that data, I think about 5 months ago, regarding the parliamentary election. But the effect that is generally observed both in Iran and internationally is a rallying. I'm sorry. Is a rallying around the flag syndrome, and not a protest against the government syndrome, when the pressure is coming from outside. These are two different instances. One, you might have a situation where the economy is getting worse because of some domestic issue, without a fear of a foreign intervention into your country. That usually generates the kind of protests that Colin was talking about, and governments all over the world are concerned with those kind of protests. But when the pressure is coming from outside, when you're dealing with an outside enemy, usually what happens, usually what has happened in the course of human history and what is happening in Iran is the exact opposite, is the rallying around the flag syndrome, that people are willing to disregard some of the shortcomings of the government merely because they want to protect the government at face of international pressure. Now, one of the data that I wish I would have included in the slides relates to the parliamentary election, which happened about 6 months ago. And in that election, the participation rate was much higher than it was expected. I mean, in Tehran, the participation rate of that election, that parliamentary election, was about 15 percentage point higher than the previous parliamentary election in Tehran alone. And throughout and this is after 2009. This is after the Green Movement.
And these
So
are
a lot of
reliable
people were saying, a lot of analysts in the West were saying that as a result of the crackdowns that occurred, a lot of people are not going to partake in the election. They're going to boycott it, whatnot. And in fact, what happened was the opposite. The participation rate in that parliamentary election went up. And in the polling we conducted, the primary reason, one of the, not the primary, but one of the most significant reason a lot of people participated was not to elect someone into the office, but was to rally around the flag, but was to show support for the government at the face of international pressure. And this is what they have said in polling data. Now, the other issue, the blame the government, that the issue that people are saying it's the sanctions, and that doesn't mean that they are not blaming the government for bringing down sanctions onto the public. The sanctions are occurring for something that people are supporting. If the government was bringing down sanctions on the public for something the public was not supporting, what Colin is saying would have been correct. But people are being punished. The Iranian government is being punished for something the Iranian people want. Okay. In that case, they are not going to blame the Iranian government for bringing down sanctions on the Iranian people, because the Iranian government is doing what the Iranian people is asking them to do. And finally, the issue that they have these sanctions been counter-effective or not And the idea that since the numbers have remained stable, it suggests that it's not being counter-effective. You know, numbers usually don't go higher than 90% in polls. You know, they are up there. It cannot increase generally. And but what is happening and what is very important is U.S. favorability rankings. That is going down. And that is, I think, very significant for policy on this issue, because that erodes the level of trust that is required to achieve any negotiated deal. You cannot negotiate a deal without some bare minimum level of trust. Otherwise, everything will have to be, you know, on the spot, give and take, very, very objective. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of confusion about what the theory of pressure is, and I think some of the confusion is that the theory is nonlinear. That is, that incremental increases in pressure don't generate changes in calculations, aren't expected to changes in calculations of this regime in a stepwise linear way. That is, X amount of pressure leads to an equivalent amount of change in behavior. In fact, it could actually, little increases in pressure can actually be counterproductive, because all they do is they reinforce the perception of hostility without causing so much pain that it forces a compromise. So it's nonlinear because it's not until you get across a threshold of really unacceptable levels of pain that it forces a decision. All right? Now, I don't know whether that's going to work or not, but it explains why we're effectively involved in the game of chicken. You know the game of chicken, right? So that's the situation that we're in. The United States and Iran are engaged in a high-stakes game of chicken, and there are only 3 outcomes that are possible. They're going to swerve at the last minute because they want to avoid a war or something that could otherwise cripple the regime. Right? So they they drink the poison chalice of some diplomatic compromise. Second, we swerve, and we acquiesce to a nuclear weapons capability. That's not going to happen. Or we crash. That's it. And if you have to bet on probabilities, I'm going to bet we crash, unfortunately. But in descending probability, crash, they swerve, we accept. It's not going to happen. The United States is not going to acquiesce to Iran having a nuclear weapons capability. Not under an Obama administration in a second term or a Romney administration. So that's it.
What do you mean by crash?
War.
Do you want to say something briefly?
Oh, just I think I agree with Ibrahim that it is very unlikely that the public will organize against in response to the sanctions in a way that is problematic for the regime and helpful to the U.S. Because there is a governing narrative that they largely accept. However, sanctions do impose costs. If you extract a certain percentage of resources from a society, then there's some problem of distribution. Who's going to take the brunt of that? And that creates tension within the society, and the government may not like that. It does create strains, and so it is a problem for them, even if the public basically stands up and salutes and says, you know, this is part of our destiny. It still does create a strain that they probably don't like.
Thank you. So I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Trita.
Trita Parsi from NIAC. Thank you for a fantastic panel. I think this was a really interesting conversation. My question is to Colin, based on the last rather scary metaphor that you presented. There was a couple of question marks that I had with it. A, within the realm of possibility, you don't include compromise from either side. You're only including that either side capitulates, which then raises the question, is that our policy as well? Is our policy to dictate the term of capitulation, or are we actually pursuing diplomacy for the sake of a compromise? Secondly, what is our red line? Is it a weapons capability, as you put it, or is it a nuclear weapon? The way you explained it was as if Romney's already won the presidency and nuclear weapons capability is the red line, and we would never accept that. But is it nuclear weapons, or is it nuclear weapons capability? Thanks so much.
Yeah. So, you know, the chicken analogy was meant to be provocative. I think I had that effect. When I said they swerve, I mean basically, look, all else being equal, this regime would like to pursue a nuclear weapons capability. Why do we know that? Because they are pursuing it, and they've been willing to absorb tremendous cost. So if they didn't value it along some, value it strategically, value it in terms of the regime's calculations about legitimacy, survival, et cetera, they would have already capitulated, right? So the swerve assumes that we give them an out, which saves their face. So I think that, this is why I think the domestic enrichment piece is extraordinarily important. I think there is a deal to be had, all right? There is a compromise to be had. There's a compromise in the space between the fatwa against nuclear weapons, the interest in the unalienable right to domestic enrichment, and also the interest in avoiding the regime getting into a war or a revolutionary situation in Iran, that set of incentives could produce a swerve by the Iranians in my analogy. When I said we swerve, I mean we basically blink. That is, we go up to the brink. We aren't able to get a compromise diplomatically, but we're also unwilling to take military action, so we swerve and we acquiesce to a nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapons capability. And the reason why I said capability is that I'm not convinced that the Supreme Leader has even made a decision about whether to fully consummate the program or simply put all the pieces in place to rapidly acquire one, if desired. Final point about difference between nuclear weapons and this administration has said that the red line is weaponization, right? Acquiring a nuclear weapon. I have no idea what Governor Romney thinks a nuclear weapons capability means. Because if it means the technical know-how to at some point produce nuclear weapons, they're across that red line. In fact, they've crossed it multiple times. And so get ready for a war on day one of a Romney administration. It probably doesn't mean that, okay? If it means what he said on 60 Minutes, which is having enough fissile material for a weapon, having a warhead, and having a delivery system, well, then it's weaponization, in which case it's the same as the president's, right? Or is it somewhere in between, like Bibi Netanyahu's, once they have enough 20% low-enriched uranium for one nuclear bomb, right? So I have no idea what Governor Romney thinks the capability is. I suspect he doesn't know what either.
Greg.
Greg Tillman, Arms Control Association. I have a question about Iranian public views toward the swap agreement in the fall of 2009, but let me just introduce it with an observation that the Iranian government has clearly won the narrative, or is winning the narrative on what this is all about. And even the way you characterize it, Mr. Mohseni, I think indicates that the sanctions are occurring because Iran is doing something the public wants. The sanctions are occurring not over the uranium enrichment issue, they're occurring over Iran's violation of its obligations under the IAEA. And that's something which, for a variety of reasons, I don't think the Iranian public perceives. It was very evident, should have been evident in the fall of 2009 when the West and the IAEA basically said Iran can continue enriching uranium for this confidence building measure, which will allow Iranian cancer patients to continue receiving their medical isotopes, and we'll just exchange the low enriched uranium for fuel plates for the reactor. That failed not just because the government took it back, but it failed because the Iranian opposition opposed it, I assume because they saw an opportunity to ding Ahmadinejad. And so it's made me very curious, how did this go over with the public? Were there polls at the time that showed the Iranian public really understood the significance of the West conceding on uranium enrichment, even taking the bitter pill of offering a deal to the obnoxious president of Iran at the time? Was that understood by the public? Are there polling indications of what was happening?
Yeah, I have no polling data exactly on that issue. There is, however, one point that I made, that the fact that some level of trust is required for any negotiated agreement to go through. It points exactly to that. The reason the opposition was able to take advantage of that situation was because there was a public hostility and lack of trust vis-a-vis the U.S. and the West. What the opposition basically said was that, look at your president, he is willing to trust. This is what he used. He is willing to trust America and trust the West with our enriched uranium. He is out of his mind. You know, that's what basically destroyed it. Once it was framed like that, Ahmadinejad could not push it forward anymore. And I bet you if there was a public opinion poll at the time, there would have been a public opposition to the swap deal, because it was framed exactly as I said it. It was framed as if, you know, it was framed like you know, Iran is trusting the West with its enriched uranium. And that basically, once it was framed that way, you know, that was the end of it. Even Ahmadinejad couldn't push it forward anymore. And he basically had to act. And the reason the Tehran, the Brazil-Turkey deal was so important was exactly because of this. In that deal, Iran no longer needed to trust the West. Iran was trusting Turkey and Brazil. And that was politically, you know, domestically, it was something that the government could take to the people. So it's a trust issue. And once it erodes to the levels you're talking about, then, you know, achieving a negotiated deal, it becomes quite unlikely.
But you'll agree that they wanted to do the deal because they wanted to avoid UN Security Council Resolution 1929 from passing, right? The motivation of the government of Iran to do the Tehran Declaration with Brazil and Turkey was not just because of trust, it was to avoid the sanctions, right? Or was it just a coincidence that it was a week before the vote at the UN?
What dumbfounded, I mean, what really angered Iranians, Brazilians, and the Turks was that the West was willing to go forward with the sanctions, despite the fact that in negotiations.
No, I understand why people were annoyed that the deal fell through. I'm asking you what the motivation of the Iranians to cut the deal to begin with was. It was to avoid the sanctions.
I have no.
There is no other motivation.
No.
It was to avoid the sanctions.
But the discussion for that negotiation between Turkey and Brazil didn't happen in 1 week's time.
Exactly.
It's a negotiation process. So how could you say that that happened a week before the sanctions?
Because the sanctions didn't happen in 1 week time. They were happening at, sir, I was in the government, they were happening at the exact same time. In fact, the negotiations up in New York and in capitals on the UN Security Council Resolution 1929 were happening for months.
Yeah.
And it was in the final weeks of that endeavor that the Iranians tried to pull a rabbit out of the hat by signing up to the Turkey-Brazil deal. Now, one could criticize whether the administration sent mixed signals to Turkey and Brazil. One can criticize whether we should have taken the deal. But that is distinct from the point that I made on the table, which is there is only one reason why the Iranians were willing to cut a deal. And it wasn't just trust. It was fear. Fear of the sanctions at the UN.
It was the basis of the trust, because when we went to the first discussion of having Iran to give the 4.5% uranium enrichment, our negotiators agreed on the principle, say yes, we will do that. But when we told them about the details, that once you give this 4.5% to us, you got to wait about a year or maybe 2 years, and you don't own this anymore. How do you think they're going to trust us? The biggest superpower in the world, the richest country in the world, the most powerful world, only 75 million people there. So you're sitting there as a government, maybe before you work with government.
You and I are talking about doing different things. I mean, we should ask, other people should have questions, but you and I are talking past each other because you're trying to explain why the deal didn't happen, and I'm explaining why the Iranians were motivated to make the deal.
I think, can I just address that part of the question? Yeah, quickly. One part of one part of the reason why the Iranians became eager and to sign the deal was Obama's letter, which was actually sent a month before they reached an agreement. Why was that letter sent if the U.S. was intending to sanction Iran? No, it was that letter which added credibility to a negotiated deal with Turkey and Brazil. And once the U.S. government, once the United States president broke his promise that was made just a month before, I mean, as you said, the negotiations for the sanctions were happening a long time ago, and U.S. was determined to sanction Iran. So why does the President of the United States send a letter to Lola and President Erdogan saying, how many kilograms? 1,200 kilograms. That's what the president asked. That's what the Iranian government gave. And that's what, when the U.S. government could not take yes as an answer.
But Ibrahim's comments point to an underlying issue, which is that there is an Iranian perception that the U.S. really doesn't want a deal, that the U.S. is on a kind of trajectory, that it really has a determination to ultimately break down Iran. And that, I think that's an important thing to frame here.
Yes. Can you please also identify yourself, your affiliation, please?
Jasmine Ramsey from IPS News. My question is to Mr. Kyle regarding the provocative analogy. I just wanted to know if this, do you think that if this Obama administration went in for a second term and they did assess that Iran had reached nuclear capability, that they would go in for a war if the assessment has been that bombing wouldn't set back the nuclear program by more than a few years?
The only person who knows that is the President of the United States. All I can do is take him on his word that all options are on the table and that Iran will be prevented from getting a nuclear weapon and that he doesn't bluff. So on that standpoint, then if Iran continues and gets close to a nuclear weapon.
Can you define capability too as well, specifically because...
Can you?
By your own definition of it.
I can tell you my own definition of what weaponization would be. I think the term capability should be, banned from the lexicon, certainly of any congressional resolution, in the absence of a definition. I can tell you what a move towards weaponization would be. I think that if Iran starts to enrich above 20%, that's a signal that there's an intent to weaponize. I think that if Iran kicks out the IAEA inspectors, which they've hinted they might do over accusations of sabotage at Fordo in recent weeks, that's evidence that the regime intends to weaponize. I think if they leave the NPT, that's evidence of an intent to weaponize. I think if we discover a third covert enrichment facility after the first two, Natanz and Fordo, both covert until outed by Western intelligence, that could be evidence of weaponization. If they start to, there are a number of other, if they get the band back together, if Fakhrizadeh and his group, who largely disbanded their organized activities in 2003, 2004, according to the IAEA, if they reorganize the weapons R&D, that would be evidence of weaponization. So each of those is evidence of an intent to weaponize, short of them actually turning the last screw to make a weapon. But that's my view. I have no idea. Other people could have a different perspective.
Yes, sir. You've been very patient. In the back, very back.
Reza Saidi, independent. I'd like to take you to Iran as a grassroots. Most of the Iranian right, left, Zoroastrian, different religions, they are suffering from activity of the one group, then they call them MKO, or Munafiqin Khalq, or Mujahideen Khalq. And unfortunately, this administration has delisted them from terrorists. And this is the trust that we're talking about, and piggyback what Mr. Collins said about changing the behavior of Iran. Iran behavior might change, but when the America is going to change this behavior, whether it is Obama or Bush, it doesn't matter. I thought you don't negotiate with terrorists, but you delist the terrorists, MKO, the whole Iranian people, they have the consensus, they are against Iranian people, and America has lost its trust last week or 2 weeks ago when they delisted this terrorist group in America.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Milton Honig from the International Center for Terrorism Studies. Mr. Mohseni mentioned the strong correlation between fear of attack and the development of nuclear weapons among, in opinion, in the Iranian population. Of course, this is a rather circular argument, since it is the development of nuclear weapons, which, of course, is the source of the Obama administration's statement about possibility of attack. But isn't Iran itself demonstrated that it's rather sensitive to this point? Specifically, an example is the last August report of the IAEA on the use of 20% enriched uranium. they've actually enriched enough 20% uranium to 20%, perhaps to make a bomb, but very cleverly they've cut it in half the amount they kept in the form of uranium hexafluoride gas, and moved the other to fabricating solid oxide fuel for the TRR reactor. In fact, they have more TRR fuel capability than they're going to need for many, many years. So isn't Iran actually showing a great deal of sensitivity to lowering the risk of having a nuclear weapon? And it will be really interesting to see what they do in the next IAEA report, which will probably be around November sometime, to see if they continue this policy of not maintaining sufficient uranium hexafluoride enriched to 20% to actually produce a nuclear weapon.
I will only say in that IAEA report, the Iranians had, it was a mixed bag. Because on the one hand, they were clearly trying to stay clear of having one bomb's worth of easily usable 20% low enriched uranium, because they oxidized about half of their stockpile. So they're not going to get up to a bomb's worth for another 6 or 8 months, and it could be longer than that if they continue to oxidize and try to turn it into fuel plates for the TRR. But they also doubled down on approaching a previous Israeli red line, which was the operationalization of Fordo, because they doubled the number of centrifuges installed in Fordo. And so they, on the one hand, they were staying, I think, clear of what they might be concerned about American red lines being on the amount of 20% LEU, but they were daring the Israelis on the Fordo question. And so that's why I think there was a little bit of a mixed bag.
Reza.
Razak Veri, Stimson Center. You mentioned that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the decision would be hard for the Iranian government to make to stop the program, given the fact that the public opinion is for it. The public want it, so if the government even wants to stop it, that's going to be very difficult to do. A few months back, Abdullah Nouri actually suggested to have a referendum on the nuclear program, and some opposition members actually protested the idea, saying that it wasn't the people's decision to begin with, so why are we putting it on the people now? So this perhaps could be irrelevant given the fact that you're just measuring the current public opinion. But as a principle, don't you think it would be unfair given the fact that the program has a long history, stretched back 50 years? It ebbed and flowed, and the people have never really been questioned to stop it or start it. But now all of a sudden, you're going to ask the Iranian people what they think and kind of use them as a scapegoat?
Well, generally governments don't ask the public when it comes to matters of sovereign rights. I mean, the U.S. government is not asking the public whether we should, invest in the in Pentagon, in our military, and in our security capabilities. That's given. That the governments are there to preserve people's rights, and the NPT clearly outlines that nuclear activity, safeguarded nuclear activity, is an inalienable right. So, to the idea that whenever the government wants to engage any program, it should go first to the public, get their endorsement, and then start, is just unprecedented. It doesn't happen anywhere. The idea, however, the main question on the other hand, however, is that when it started, as you said, 50 years ago, right at the start, if there was an opposition to it, it could have been, expressed. There was in the history of Iran, there has never been a time when there has been a public opposition to the government pursuing a nuclear program, particularly a civilian one. So, I mean, that's as far as I can answer that question.
Okay, so we should probably take 2 more questions. Yes, in the back. Thank you.
Claire Young, I'm a recent graduate of Columbia University. I have a follow-up question to the last one, also for Ibrahim. Thank you for your presentation. I thought it was fascinating, but the unstated assumption is that changes in public opinion matter to put it crudely, to the Iranian government, and that they themselves are tracking public opinion, and that if there are these big changes, that they will potentially adjust their policies, any policies, but particularly nuclear policies, accordingly. Can you give us a sense from your experience at Tehran University what domestic efforts are going on to gauge public opinion inside Iran, what the methodologies are like, are they similar to us, and then also your assessment of how that factors into the Iranian government's decision making?
Perfect question. I was actually waiting for that. In fact, the #1 polling party in Iran is the government of Iran. There are several polling agencies run by the government, the data rarely published, that gauges public opinion on a wide variety of issues. What is in fact even more interesting, that each, there are parallel polls that they're basically conducting the same research, but the government is so concerned with public opinion that it funds multiple government agencies to basically run the same polls to gauge the same idea, just to be sure that it has a good sense of public opinion. So whether the idea that the government of Iran does not care for public opinion is just it's just not unfounded, because it's investing so much both in influencing public opinion and in gauging public opinion, and the methodologies they use. If you have Iran has great methodologists, and it's basic survey methodology, random sample, scientific questions, and that. So the private sector is also thriving. I mean, it's the active polling in Iran is on the rise, and much more than years before. But in general, both on the private sector and the public sector, there's a lot of effort going on engaging public opinion. And few of them, again, the problem is that few of them are published. But again, there are a lot of published polls as well.
The question probably isn't do they care about public opinion, but what the motivation is for finding out what public views are. I mean, I guess that's the real issue.
The motivation is the same motivation that any government has. I mean, they want to know whether what they're doing is eliciting public support. If it is, that's good. If it's not, and if the government really is invested in the activity that it is doing that is not garnering public support, to increase, try efforts to influence public opinion in favor of the government policy.
Thank you. So one more question, Alan.
Alan Kieswetter from CNO Resources, the Middle East Institute, and I have a question for Dr. Mohseni. This past week, a new report was released called The Ayatollah's Gamble, and it has some startling statistics in it. A major attack on Iran could kill about 10,000 people or more because of blast effects, but more importantly, release dangerous levels of radiation into the atmosphere that would maybe affect as 250,000 or even more. The study is based on 4 scenarios, and this is largely Isfahan. My question to you, the plan now is to publish this in Persian, one presumes on net, on the internet, and what will be the effect on Iran? Will people read it? Will they believe it? Will it increase fears? Will it have an effect?
I don't think the Iranian public doubt U.S. capability to decimate their country. I mean, they have seen what, as Colin said, they have seen what happened in Iraq, they have seen what has happened in Afghanistan, they've seen it all over the place. That I don't think they have any doubt that U.S. has the capability to kill Iranians. I mean, they don't have that. They don't have any doubt about that capability. But what is important is there's this Iranian proverb which says that we are not going to commit suicide out of fear of death. We are not going to commit suicide out of fear of death. So the fear of death is there, that the U.S. and believe you me, they don't feel that U.S. is constrained at all in doing that. They think that if U.S. finds it in its interest to engage in that kind of a war, it would not mind if it would be a war of aggression. They don't feel that U.S. is constrained by international law in any way because they have seen evidence of it, and at least in Iraq in particular. So, yeah, I mean, the idea that they fear it, it's there. But whether that fear is going to translate into capitulation, I don't see any evidence of it. And it's not, again, I want to emphasize on this. This is not only with the case of Iran. I mean, if you study other countries that have gone through the same experience, rarely, very infrequently, do governments or publics simply, surrender under threat of military confrontation. It's part of the, you have to sacrifice your honor, you have to sacrifice your dignity, you have to sacrifice your identity. And that's equivalent to death for all nations. It's not only Iran. Turn it around vis-a-vis the U.S. Wouldn't it be the same thing? Russia had the capability to, destroy the U.S. and the whole world 10,000 times. Did that make U.S. raise its hand? No. The U.S. made itself as strong so that it would be able to resist that pressure. It balanced against it. And that's what usually governments do. At the face of threats, they balance against it. They don't capitulate.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, and please join me in applauding our great panel.